What happens when politics stops asking for loyalty and starts demanding reverence? In a country already divided by war, fear, and power, one image has suddenly turned outrage into something deeper, something almost sacred. As Washington returns from recess, a new political storm is brewing. A U.S. senator warns that America may be crossing a line from leadership into a dangerous spectacle, from public service into political worship. But this is not just about one post, one man, or one scandal. It is about silence, complicity, and a system that keeps pushing the limits while the world watches. And if this moment really is a turning point, then what comes next may say more about America than the image itself ever could.
It's 2-week Easter recess today, with lawmakers facing a packed agenda. At the top of the list, of course, the war in Iran. Democrats in both the House and Senate are expected to once again push an effort to rein in President Trump by teeing up votes on war powers resolutions. Joining us now, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. He's a member of the Foreign Relations, Judiciary, and Appropriations Committees. Good to have you on. Do you think that Democrats will have any luck with their Republican counterparts as it pertains to the ongoing war with Iran?
Look, Mika, I certainly hope we will. As you just mentioned, we're coming back from an Easter recess, a recess in which President Trump opened on Easter with a hateful, angry tweet suggesting he was about to wipe out an entire civilization. And when Pope Leo, the leader of 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide, pushed back on that statement, pushed back on war and President Trump's immigration policies, as well as his conduct of this war in Iran, President Trump has escalated by personally attacking the Pope, and then shockingly this morning, posting an AI-generated visual of him as Jesus Christ. Mika, there's 70 million Catholics in this country. This is an overwhelmingly Christian country, but a country of faith where we respect each other, that was rooted in freedom of worship, freedom of religion. It seems to me that Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance and President Trump seem determined to secure their white Christian nationalist base and to push aside and to offend and to distance themselves from all the good people of our nation who want good things for our country and for each other. This has been a very dark chapter. And one of the things I've been struck by is the silence of so many of my colleagues on the other side. It was Martin Luther King who said the real tragedy is not the cruelty of the bad, but the silence of the good. And I'm hopeful we will hear some voices this week speaking up and saying our national leader, our president, should not be attacking one of the world's greatest religions, should not be putting himself in the space of my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and of one of the most important figures in world history, not least of which spiritual history. This is a watershed moment for those who want to stand for decency and for the values that founded our country.
I have to ask you about that silence, though, because it definitely is. And the Easter message, the picture of the president himself as Jesus Christ. Right. The silence on the side of your Republican counterparts, for the most part. I mean, there are, I guess, a few voices. There are. I mean, there are some things, Senator, that don't take prep, that you don't need to discuss. Right. And I think we can put those in that category. So then how do you explain the silence on the Republican side at this turning point in history?
So over and over since Trump returned to the presidency, he's made outrageous statements. I'm going to make Canada the 51st state. I'm going to wrest Greenland away from our trusted NATO ally, Denmark. I'm going to retake the Panama Canal. Statements that have really unsettled our closest, most trusted allies and have made us less safe. And a few Republicans have really spoken up about that. I led a bipartisan delegation to Denmark, for example, earlier this year, where Senators Tillis and Murkowski joined me. And other Republican senators have stood up for NATO when Trump has gone after them. But this seems to me a whole nother level. To literally and explicitly threaten genocide against the civilization, the ancient Persian civilization of Iran, and then to keep carrying out a war that Pope Leo has called an immoral war, and that is certainly a war not authorized by the American people, and where Trump changes its scope and purpose and cost from day to day. Look, the average American is going to get up today and see the price of gas go up. If President Trump thinks he's got a solution to the closing of the Strait of Hormuz by the Iranians, threatening to now fully close it using the American Navy is both risky and likely to send the price of gas and the price of daily living for Americans skyrocketing.
So, Senator, let's talk a little bit more about this blockade that the president announced after peace talks in Islamabad fell apart without a deal this weekend. You mentioned it, that the price of oil undoubtedly will go up.
Right.
We're seeing it already overnight. We can see that will likely continue in the coming days. But talk to us about some other issues that you see with this, including, this is something we mentioned an hour or so back on the show, how Beijing is going to react the first time one of their ships gets stopped by an American naval vessel.
So this is the most critical vulnerability that China has, that if we were to secure control over Iran's oil exports, would give us huge strategic leverage, comparable to their leverage over us in critical minerals. But to do so would require an act of war, a naval blockade. And I don't believe we're prepared for it. I don't believe the American people have been prepared for it. I don't think our naval assets in the region are ready for it. This is an enormously risky maneuver. And I'll remind you, what comes out of the Strait of Hormuz isn't just gas, the oil that's produced, but natural gas, fertilizer, and helium. Now, why do those matter? Fertilizer is critical right now for the planting season in dozens of countries around the world. We're going to see another wave of hunger as a result of this blockade. Helium's critical to a whole bunch of MRIs. Anybody get an MRI around here? And so Trump's going to skyrocket the prices for the average American and put our security at risk. And Xi Jinping doesn't face midterm elections. His ability to survive this moment and to test whether or not our allies are going to stick with us in the Western Pacific and in Europe gives him a huge opportunity. I hope and pray that we're back at the table negotiating with the Iranians this week, rather than this ongoing blustering approach by President Trump for a war of choice that he's stumbled into.
And he's at least still considering the idea of reviving military strikes, though he has not given that order just yet. Senator Coons, we also want to get your reaction. You sit on the Foreign Relations Committee, of course, about what we saw in Hungary yesterday. A remarkable win, a trouncing of Viktor Orban, which means so much for the people there, but also, I'd argue, sends a signal around the globe. It is a defeat, certainly, for Vladimir Putin. And it's a defeat, let's be clear, for President Trump and his closest allies who all went to Hungary to campaign for Orban.
He sent J.D. Vance to campaign for Orban in the last couple of days. J.D.'s had a pretty tough week. Our vice president, he's got a president personally attacking the Pope. He is a recent convert to Catholicism. He went to campaign for Orban, who lost decisively. He went to try and negotiate a peace deal with the Iranians. How's that going? Millions of Hungarians responded to Peter Magyar, whose party won an overwhelming victory, because he went throughout the country campaigning on local issues. The terrible mismanagement of a weak economy and the open corruption of an authoritarian. I think there's a message in there for anyone else who's facing elections around the world, that in a democracy, average folks are looking for a better quality of life for them and their families, for improved security, and they don't like bald and gross corruption. I think there's some corollaries here for the United States in our upcoming elections.
Democratic member of the Foreign Relations, Judiciary and Appropriations Committee, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika,
for coming on this.
In the end, this story is bigger than a social media post, bigger than a television segment, bigger even than the latest cycle of outrage that usually burns fast and disappears by the next morning. Because what we're witnessing here is not simply another political controversy. It is a test of boundaries, a test of how far power can stretch symbolism before symbolism becomes provocation, and how long institutions can remain silent before silence itself becomes part of the story. Senator Chris Coons calls this a watershed moment, and whether one agrees with him or not, the phrase matters. A watershed is not just conflict, it is a dividing line, a before and an after, a point beyond which things do not return to exactly what they were, and that is what gives this moment its weight. At the center of this storm is an image, an AI-generated portrayal of Donald Trump as Jesus Christ, posted in the middle of a national atmosphere already charged by war rhetoric, religious tension, and political exhaustion. In another era, an image like that might have been dismissed as fringe provocation. But in this era, where images move faster than facts and spectacle often outrun substance, it becomes something far more powerful. It becomes a signal, a message not only to supporters, but to critics, institutions, allies, and rivals. It says that politics is no longer content with authority alone. It wants mythology, it wants emotional submission. It wants to occupy spaces once reserved for principle, faith, and moral restraint. And when that happens, the real danger is not only what is posted, but what people are pressured to tolerate. That is why Coons does not frame this as ordinary partisan disagreement. He frames it as a moral line. He points not only to the image, but to the atmosphere around it, the hateful language, the personal attacks on Pope Leo, the sense that the boundaries separating political leadership from cultural desecration are being deliberately erased. And in doing so, he raises the question that now hangs over Washington. When public behavior crosses into something this openly inflammatory, who speaks, who objects, and who stays quiet? Because the silence of opponents may be expected. But the silence of supposed allies, colleagues, and institutional guardians tells a deeper story. It suggests that fear, strategy, and political survival may now matter more than the defense of shared standards. And that silence is not happening in a vacuum. It is unfolding against the backdrop of a much more dangerous global crisis. The war with Iran, the threat of escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, the possibility of naval confrontation, and the economic shockwaves that could hit ordinary households first and hardest. This is where the conversation in the video becomes especially potent. It refuses to treat culture war symbolism and foreign policy recklessness as separate stories. Instead, it links them. The same politics that thrive on spectacle at home may also be creating volatility abroad. The same leadership style that courts outrage in public messaging may also normalize risk in international decision-making. And when that happens, the consequences are no longer abstract. They show up in gas prices, food insecurity, shipping lanes, strategic instability, and the growing sense that everyday people are being forced to absorb the cost of elite performance. That may be the most revealing part of all. Because for millions of Americans, politics no longer feels like a battle over ideas. It feels like a machinery of chaos whose costs are paid downward. If oil prices rise, if supply chains are squeezed, if war expands, if allies lose trust, if religious wounds are inflamed, ordinary people feel it first. Not the people posting the images, not the people crafting the slogans, not the people gambling on loyalty. The public does, families do, workers do, voters do. And that is why the language in this segment lands with such force. It is not just accusing the owner of being offensive. It is accused of being irresponsible, morally, politically, and strategically at the same time. Then there is the international dimension, which turns this from a domestic media moment into something much larger. The mention of China, shipping routes, leverage, fertilizers, helium, and the pressure points of global trade reminds us that America's political theater does not stay inside America. Every act of instability radiates outward. Every reckless escalation opens doors for rivals. Every insult to allies, every confused objective, every improvised threat weakens the perception of control. And in that vacuum, other powers calculate. They test, they wait, they exploit. What seems like a culture war fight on a screen can become a geopolitical opportunity in the real world. That is why rhetoric matters. Because rhetoric becomes posture, posture becomes policy, and policy becomes consequence. Even the final section of the video widens the lens further. The reference to Hungary, to Viktor Orban's setback, to voter frustration over corruption and quality of life adds a final layer to the documentary arc. This is not just an American story. It is part of a global pattern. Across democracies, people are showing signs of fatigue. Fatigue with personality cults, fatigue with performative nationalism, fatigue with leaders who promise strength but deliver instability, spectacle, and self-preservation. What voters often want is far less theatrical: affordability, dignity, security, honesty, and a future that feels less fragile than the present. And whenever political branding becomes louder than daily reality, the backlash eventually begins to form. So what does this moment really tell us? It tells us that the line between politics and iconography is being contested in public. It tells us that war and messaging are no longer separate chapters, but part of the same narrative of power. It tells us that silence can be as revealing as speech. And above all, it tells us that democracies are often tested, not only by the ambition of leaders, but by the willingness of everyone around them to excuse what should have been confronted. That is the true heartbeat of this story. Not just what was posted, but what the post exposed. Not just who spoke out, but who did not. Not just the offense, but the permission structure surrounding it. And maybe that is why this moment feels so unsettling. Because beneath the outrage is a deeper recognition. When politics starts borrowing the language of salvation, when criticism is treated like betrayal, and when institutions hesitate to draw basic lines, the issue is no longer one controversial figure. The issue is the health of the system itself. A healthy democracy does not ask its citizens for worship. It asks them for vigilance. It does not survive on spectacle. It survives on limits, on accountability, on the courage to say no when power pushes too far. So as this chapter closes, the image may fade, the headlines may rotate, and the outrage cycle may move on. But the question will remain. Was this just another provocation designed to dominate attention for a day? Or was it a warning shot? Proof that the center of political gravity is shifting into something darker, more performative, and more dangerous. That answer will not come from one segment or one speech alone. It will come from what the country chooses to normalize next. And that is why this story matters. Because the most important moments in history do not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes they arrive disguised as content, as controversy, as something easy to scroll past. But if you look closely, they reveal the condition of a nation in real time. Watch the silence, watch the reactions, watch what people defend and what they refuse to condemn. Because in moments like this, a country tells you exactly what it is becoming